We can start with our first lecture by Duško Petrović. Our colleague, and his title is Ordinary Effects During Democratization of Violence in the Context of the Breakup of Yugoslavia. Duško, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Costa.
Yes.
You heard the title of the presentation. I should maybe read it again, you know. It's too long. The title is Ordinary Effects During Democratization of Violence in the Context of the Breakup of Yugoslavia. So we have some complicated title, but the process was also complicated, as you know. We can observe this process maybe in two ways. We had collapse of one state, yes, Yugoslavia, and then the process of creation of ethno-national states on this territory of former Yugoslav Federation. And I think this process of creation of new states did not end. It's still ongoing, you know, process. So it's very interesting, you know. And of course, after the creation of these new states, we had, of course, this specific narrative structures. Each state has its own narrative structure of this, all narrative of this process and the war, memories of the war, some contact. We have some clashes over the memories of this event, of breakup of Yugoslavia, but I was not dealing with this that question, you know, like different perspectives on the war and the history of these national states. But I was, you know, like concentrated on one particular phenomenon that I called democratization of violence. And so the overall thesis is that in the process of creating nation states within the territory that had until then been Yugoslavia, the 1990s amounted to a democratization of violence. So in my opinion, this perspective has largely eluded the hundreds of other works which have already been written about war, violence, and similar subjects. So, but today I'm not going to elaborate on this concept of democratization of violence, sorry. It's tricky stuff, but more precisely, I will be talking about the motive for writing and researching this topic of democratization of violence. And this motive was, in a way, very personal and let's say, emotional. What is the right word? And this motive was, you know, like was materialized in a method of research. So the motive and method were very, you know, like connected. So I approached the topic of breakup of Yugoslavia through an auto-ethnographic recollection of my own memories and insights into the experience of others in written records, research interviews, as well as, and this is very important, you know, everyday conversations that I have often had about that period. And I have directed research at a subject which I believe to have thus far inadequately addressed in the current works. So you should remember this everyday conversation. So this is ongoing process, you know, in my opinion. So more precisely, my interlocutors often mentioned ambiguous and intense affects, which I myself can reluctantly recall. These effects were widespread at the time and essentially determined the experience of living in the various political communities that emerged out of the former Yugoslav Federation. It is worth noting that we often, at that time and maybe now, lack names for some of these effects. Perhaps this was precisely because they emerged out of experience that were until then unfamiliar to us. Today, I can best describe this affective state as being like immersion immersion in particular kind of atmosphere. Immersion in a particular kind of atmosphere. It's precisely our inability to clearly articulate what defines that atmosphere. That is either an indicator or possibly a symptom illustrating the key features of the social situation at the time. So this is very important for me. You know. This atmosphere, this intense effects at the time. I have come across attempted definitions of this atmosphere in terms of such as atmosphere, yes, of course, but also psychosis, fear, and hysteria in individual works by intellectuals, artists, and scholars who have dealt with the 90s. In trying to describe the social situation of the time and the start of the war, it seems that many indeed resort to such psychological and affective categories. For instance, at the poignant place in the introduction to his book about the breakup of Yugoslavia, your colleague Dan Jovic reaches for a psychological interpretation to which it seems that there is no need to return to for further clarification later in the text. So I'm quoting here. A fear of becoming a minority, which arose with the crisis in Marxism and the promotion of liberal democratic concepts, resulted in the identification of new others. This fear therein caused a psychosis, which resulted in aggression. This is very interesting, in my opinion. Also, in his autobiographical book, for instance, musician and journalist Nikola Čelan from Croatian town of Split, Costa's hometown, in his book Heritage, Baština, Nikola Čelan describes the May 1991 protests held in front of the Yugoslav army's garrison in the city. And he said, "That was the day when the violence of war entered through the front door into my neighborhood. And although the city was spared significant destruction, over the next few years, we could feel the wartime psychosis in its fullest sense, both on the mental and the physical level." I likewise found descriptions that are packed with affective categories also in the individuals that deal with the social situation and the start of the war in Split, for instance. So we have a quote of some journalist. He said, "An anonymous statement by former journalist testifies to the atmosphere of fear back then and today's," that's very interesting, today's unease. We are speaking now 2015, 2016 reports. And he said, "A massive fear existed which could not be seen. On the one hand, there was the illusion of normal life, the usual offering in cinemas, the usual shows on the television, and reports that something, that is very important, that something was happening somewhere else, which could not be verified. You did not know, for instance, what was really going on in Osijek, for instance, just as those in Osijek did not know what was happening here in Split." For instance, Bojan Munin, who was an activist for the Croatian Helsinki Committee during the 1990s, and is nowadays a theater critic, describes, as he puts it, an atmosphere of hysteria before and after the war broke out in 1991 and 1992, when people walking along the streets of Croatian cities in military and paramilitary uniforms was a common sight. This was, and again, we have this notion of the prevailing atmosphere at the time when many people who had been labeled as enemies, or at least believed that they had been thus labeled, left their homes in fear, losing them forever thereafter. We are here speaking mostly about people of different ethnic origin. I will explain later. So during my research within the personal memories collection that was compiled by Zagreb's Documenta Center for Dealing with the Past, I discovered how the word atmosphere was used by both the historian Hrvoje Klasić and the music critic Ante Petrović to describe the social situation before the war and then during it in Croatia. It is worth pointing out that they, like many other witnesses, did not define the impending reality of war through clear spatial temporal criteria. From their testimonies, we gain the impression of some sort of war that was going on everywhere, all of the time, in your building, out on the street, in the neighborhood. And at the same time, the existential fear of the encroaching enemy, in the cases of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Croatia, was mixed and intervened with a general atmosphere of insecurity, fueled by the presence of members of military units and also paramilitaries, armed civilians, and various other violent groups who were out on the streets. So, maybe a few questions. Now, I was wondering that can we assume that these sorts of affective interpretations of the social reality are imposed in social situations in which people lack prepared, articulate answers and clear guidelines for how to act? Can we assume that people are simply lost for words in such circumstances, that they are taken aback or at least feel affected? Okay, it is my thesis or belief that such affective afflictions can occur in societies in which the current order has lost its legitimacy and in which citizens' trust has been violated so much so that those who were until yesterday neighbors have now become enemies or have at least begun to be perceived as such. So there are multiple factors in play here. The rules and norms that were in place up until then must have ceased to be valid. The legitimacy of institutions must have been rocked, and plenty of valid laws are only applied partially or selectively. So we have partial application of laws and this normative structure that was present before the situation. Along these lines, when speaking about the social situation in Croatia, for instance, and after mentioned suspension of laws before and after the outbreak of war in 1991, Stjepan Mesić, the former president of Croatia, stated in 2016 interview that this has been a period of lawlessness. So my theory is that under such dramatically altered circumstances, many citizens, those who followed or believed in norms and rules, temporarily lose the ability to articulate the new state of affairs and the possibility for social agency, whilst all sorts of tyrants, self-declared masters, small and big-time criminals, and self-proclaimed messiahs leave to fill the empty space that lawlessness opens up. And I think, and this is very important, the consequences of this social enemy, I believe, can be, like not just constant, but this enemy can be felt in the present day in the society that I analyzed in this article, and that you live in Croatia, Serbia, and so on. So now I will stop here, and I think I should read some of this ethnographical material for you to get a sense of this atmosphere and what was going on really at that time. The title of this chapter is Sarajevo, beginning of war in Sarajevo, when Yaliyashi rules. The Yaliyashi is a word of Turkish origin, which entered Sarajevo's urban jargon through its Ottoman history to describe a petty criminal or gang member, a person like that. So, okay, I will read this paragraph. So I experienced the start of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina as 15-year-old in my native Sarajevo. Although the war had already been raging for some time in Croatia and southern and northern parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina, it arrived in Sarajevo as a surprise, raining down upon us like an invisible spring storm in March and April 1992. But even by the end of April 1992, the period I'm describing, there had still not been any intense military operations. There was some open fighting in nearby suburban areas, but Sarajevo residents knew very little about this. Although the city itself did not come under systematic bombardment, there were certain parts that were occasionally shelled. The Yugoslav army was still to officially join the conflict in Sarajevo at this stage. So although the majority of its residents were yet to experience total war, as it would be later conducted, life in besieged Sarajevo had nevertheless completely changed. The city was blocked off, and you could not neither leave it nor enter it at your own free will. There was a curfew in place at night, or, and this is very important, at least that was the impression that was held in my family and among our neighbors in our apartment building. I cannot remember that the police, having ever officially announced it or systematically implemented it. I never saw any official police patrols in my neighborhood, but occasionally there were armed civilians whose status and roles were unclear. Supplies lines were cut, and there was a shortage of food and medicine. So the public order that had been in place until that point, which had been provided by the state, of course, state services, above all others the police, suddenly ceased to be valid, and there was a normative vacuum. Stores were looted. They were looted by the citizens, overwhelmed by the collapse of the system. It was fascinating to observe how the abolition of public order caused some to also misplace their moral compasses, with neighbors who had until yesterday been respectable turning into robbers and opportunists. You could see groups of armed civilians cruising around the city in stolen cars beyond the supervision or structure of the police or military. Generally speaking, there was unclear feeling of this lawlessness in which anything was possible. And so yesterday's petty criminals and local yariashi turned into sort of provisional government. It really was a rule of some sort of peculiar state of exception. However, this did not arise out of publicly announced decisions, but rather through the tacit and clear dissolution and abandonment of public order and law. So on the one hand, citizens themselves stopped upholding the order by breaking laws. On the other hand, the official institutions had indeed stopped functioning because, for instance, it was possible to rob a store without encountering any consequences. In other words, the official institutions abruptly lost their legitimacy and effectiveness, and in their place came armed groups with it not being clear how they had been formed or on the basis of which rules they would operate. They simply filled the space that had been left behind the state's repressive apparatus, and certainly were not grounded in the democratic consent of the majority of citizens. Although their primary tacitly approved legitimacy stemmed from their defensive function, their scope of activity extended far beyond this, often crossing over into the realm of ordinary criminality. It was in this way, for instance, very soon after the war reached my neighborhood, with the blessing of these newly armed groups, pretty much all of the cars of any value were stolen. It was the citizens, of course, who suffered this direct loss without any compensation. Even before, and now this is very interesting, even before the start of the war in Sarajevo, you can sense an atmosphere in which public order was breaking down a little bit. After then, unknown armed men blocked off the city for the first time, and I'm here referring to the to erection of barricades by the Serbian paramilitaries in Sarajevo after the independence referendum in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was held from 29 February to 1st of March 1992. This formal reason for erecting the barricades was the murder of Nikola Gardović, the father of the groom, at an Orthodox wedding. It was a very big event at that time, scandal. The murder, for which nobody at that time was adequately punished, was committed by Ramis Delalić, a well-known criminal and later commander in the army of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So that was the formal cause for erecting these barricades. So after that, the school stopped working, and the streets became filthy, and the city service stopped functioning. So it was, a very, very peculiar atmosphere where everything is collapsing. You see the dirty streets, very, people, some groups of civilians gathering, talking. It was very, tense atmosphere. So after the start of the war in early April, the situation significantly deteriorated. These initial days of fighting, which was still to escalate in an open conflict between the Yugoslav army and Serbian forces on the one side, against Sarajevo defenders on the other, apart from the general chaos and looting, were also marked by a state of general mistrust between fellow citizens and fear of activities by a Serbian fifth column that was very active at the time. This fifth column was believed to be comprised of citizens of Serbian ethnicity, members of the Serbian Democratic Party, and Serbs serving in the Yugoslav army. Information spread around the city about snipers and other sorts of scouts. The forces of the paramilitaries and militias took the lead in identifying and uncovering those people, often on the basis of hearsay and unreliable tip-offs. On several occasions, I was witness to the removal of apparently suspicious people from the neighborhood by groups and armed civilians, and I heard rumors that they were then beaten during the interrogations. It was only after the war that my parents told me that our family also could have met an undesirable fate due to the simple children's game at the time. To explain, we had a light in the apartment which had a dimmer switch so you could control its brightness. One evening, my brother and I were playing with the switch, quickly turning the brightness up and down. So somebody noticed this, and immediately, on account of our Serbian sound surname Petrović, suspected that we were sending signals to the enemy. We were saved thanks to the intervention of our neighbor, who was a member of one of the newly founded paramilitary groups. He vouched for us, confirming that we were not working with the Serbian enemy. Because of our suspicious surname, which could be Serbian, our apartment was searched multiple times during the war by various military groups. So at that time, anybody in Sarajevo could be labeled as an enemy on the basis of ethnic identity, irrespective of civil, political, or even battlefield activities. In other words, from the very outset, ethnic identity undermined the civic identity, which rapidly lost its legitimacy, even as a concept. Ethnic identity was the basis upon which some people were objectively afforded the status of being enemies, or for the loss of the most basic level of trust in them that members of a community can grant. A civic identity was not formally abolished, but it was delegitimized and rearranged along ethnic lines, with the civil relationship between people that are customary within a civil society being destroyed. But the possession of a civil status was not in itself enough to guarantee safety from arbitrary violent outbursts. it was more important to belong to the right ethnic identity. But even then, even that did not provide complete protection from acts of violence. So the newly established ethnic enemy was not some kind of, I don't know, political public enemy in this context, with whom the borders are being established, but rather an enemy with whom the demarcation was constantly being redrawn within one's buildings, neighborhood, and the city. So the public space of the political community was in this way destroyed, and the relationship of hostility and consequently fear thus crept into the very heart of the community, creating the conditions for the democratization of violence on an everyday level between citizens who had been friends and neighbors until yesterday. So later, of course, I read some of the reports from police also and these official institutions, and then I found that the deputy head of Sarajevo Security Services gave a detailed, and a friend of my family, gave a detailed description of the process through which the para-police and paramilitary units were formed under leadership of criminals who went by distinctive names like Čelo, Juka, Zuka, Caco, blah, blah, whose scope of activities greatly surpassed a defensive role. They firstly took on the role of the police, albeit expanding it with additional combat and economic activities. They secured certain neighborhoods, fought against fifth columnists, traitors and spies, ran jails in which they imprisoned and tortured suspicious people, stole, trafficked and smuggled. At the start of the war, units like these gained legitimacy from the central political party in Sarajevo, SDA, and people close to it, and all of a sudden they turned into official defense forces. The criminal records of their members were set aside so long as they legitimized themselves as supporters of the nationalistic political platform, or even more simply, for as long as they were one of us. And this was especially the case when they were ready to fight against the enemy. With the partial dismantling of the state apparatus and cooperation with the para-state, paramilitary and para-police groups, the line was blurred between the official and unofficial, the private and the public, friends and enemies, and the way was opened up for the further escalation of the conflict, which so soon turned into open war. So this was one sketch from Sarajevo near the beginning of the war. So now, I don't know, I have more time. 15 minutes. Yeah, I don't know what to do. Tell me, of course, tell me. Okay, now we can maybe turn to at the beginning of this presentation, or I will turn to the beginning of the presentation. And as I said, I pointed out in the text that you should remember this, that we are still, we are still talking about in every day, we are still talking about this atmosphere, this intense affective atmosphere, and the situation that was going on. Right? And my question maybe could be as this, and I said at one point that maybe we can, in present day, still sense something of that atmosphere, or in a slightly different way. So my food for thought would be that the question, yeah? So did this atmospheric attunement completely vanish, or is it still silently present and in a way enigmatic, still shaping our sense of the world, of the society? So, or can we, the breakup of Yugoslavia, interpret as a traumatic event, some sort of state of exception that shattered the ordinary life, or maybe a still ongoing crisis that can be felt in the present day, in the society emerged after the breakup of Yugoslavia. That was my contribution to this talk about trauma and events and something like that. I can quote Senka Vodic pointed to Lauren Berland and this and her analysis of this affected atmospheric state and attunements, and she has maybe something to offer to us theoretically about this. She said once, and I'm quoting, the trauma theory conventionally focuses on exceptional shock and data loss in the memory and experience of a catastrophe, implicitly suggesting that the subject ordinarily archived the intensities neatly and efficiently with an eye towards easy access. And she claimed is that the most such happenings that force people to adapt to an unfolding change are better described by notion of systemic crisis or crisis ordinariness. So that was my idea when I pointed out to this in the beginning of the presentation, this everyday conversations, about this atmospheric attunement and these intense effects. Is this still, some kind of ordinary situation, or is it embedded in our everyday experience? In some way, silently present, still shaping our experience of the society and the world. Still, maybe still demanding or pressing people who are living in societies in former Yugoslavia to be, still aware or to wonder about what happened, what was going on there. So still in a way enigmatic, experience that as some kind of, I don't know, some very strange entity, pressing, forcing us to talk about this again and again, but in this way, not in the standard as this narrative structure of ethnic identity, past, I don't know, history. I don't know, in Croatia we have this, what is called homeland war, or 1,000-year dream of Croatian nationhood. So, and unfolding at the end of the war, and then the history stopped at that time, in the 1990s, and now we are living this present, in the present, in this very peculiar.
In the nightmare, not in the dream.
In the nightmare of the present. So that was my intervention in this what you say, class, what is it? School. Is it school or class? I don't know. Summer school, not really summer school. That's the word. Okay, thank you.